What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown.
You're tuned into season 2, episode 2 of The Last Dope Intellectual. All right, y'all, we're ready for this week's edition of Shoot the Shit, and we are so excited to announce that we already have 5 patrons. When we made the appeal last week, we didn't really know what was going to happen with Patreon. We just knew that it was something that we should set up, but it seems like you all are down to support the cause and help us pay 2 Black for his labor. And so we want to say thank you to Gabriel, Naftali, Deborah, Michael, and Jadarian for being our first 5 patrons.
Thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it.
So, to the shit we about to shoot. All right, first up, Layla Brown, you brought this to my attention that Bolsonaro in Brazil have been found guilty of crimes against humanity by the Brazilian Senate. And so this happened very recently. And so, like, what are y'all thoughts on this? Like, what is this another sort of symbolic victory? Is something actually going to come out of this? Is it important, or is it basically like land acknowledgement?
To be honest, I can't speak to whether or not this is going to be something symbolic, essentially, like an impeachment. But I do think it's important because, the article that I wrote last year, The Pandemic of Racial Capitalism, one of the things that I was really paying attention to were the particular ways that certain countries were negligently handling the pandemic. And so there were lots of parallels between what was happening in the US, what was happening in Brazil, and that the numbers are so similar in the US and Brazil. And so for the Brazilian Senate to basically say that Bolsonaro's decision to not take COVID seriously makes him directly responsible for the deaths of over 600,000 Brazilians, I think it's a major step. Like, I don't know, I can't really imagine what that would look like in the US context for a sitting or even previous US president to be accused, let alone found guilty of being directly responsible for genocidal levels of death in their own country, right? So, I can't really speak to the question of whether or not it's symbolic or performative or what, but I do think it's important that they even found the gall or wherewithal to try him and then convict him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, to my understanding on the story, the Senate is ran by the opposition party, obviously, to Bolsonaro, but the recommendation that they made would be sent to I think the defense minister. I may not be getting the title right, but either way, that's a Bolsonaro appointee, so they're more than likely to not do anything. Now, granted, the fact that it got that far to the point where there was even some type of I guess symbolic sanction, like we'll be talking about in the Live from the Streets, as far as like genocide and how they're able to document it and lay out the case. I was trying to find the document, but I couldn't find an English version of it. But it's like 1,100 pages, just breaking down all the different sins that this man has done. So I don't think it would happen here, but I think at the same time it is somewhat symbolic. You would get similar, like you did get the impeachment twice, with Trump, but because the other party is so in the pocket of the dictator, so to speak, nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to point out though that it was him being found guilty of crimes against humanity was actually a lesser charge than what the Senate had initially wanted to try him for. I can't remember exactly what the charge was, but it was already a concession from what the initial sort of charges that were launched against Bolsonaro.
Well, it's because he was committing genocide. Basically, they were saying he's committing genocide against the indigenous people, right? Because he's made a lot of terrible comments. I wrote a few down, like, says it's a shame that the Brazilian cavalry wasn't as efficient as Americans who exterminated their Indians. He said Indians smell, are uneducated, and don't speak our language. This is before he became president. If I become president, there will be not 1 centimeter more of indigenous land. And he corrected himself later on to say he meant 1 millimeter. So this is the type of, and then he's also launched like attack on their lands. There's a division that's supposed to protect indigenous lands called I think the FUNA. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, and they like he's been dismantling that division, which is already severely underfunded and pretty much inadequate in protecting those people. So yeah, that's what I think the charge, like, because he's been a completely on an assault since he's gotten office on the indigenous folks.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about two things here, and this is just my cynicism. I think it's just so much easier to indict or to hold accountable like an outright fascist, right? Or a Trump or a Bolsonaro. But I wonder if this had happened under whatever the
Lulu.
Brazilian equivalent of a Biden would be.
Lulu.
What? Yeah, Lula and Haiti. That's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, if this was happening under a so-called a liberal or progressive person, if it would be the same type of outcome, right? Because these people are just so egregious. They're so outright with their ignorance and their sort of, bald neglect that is sort of, it's easier, right? But even in this world, it's still noteworthy that even they are held accountable. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. And the second thing is people, it's sort of the way we attend to sort of mass death or like a sort of uptick in death versus like the slow death that happens under capitalism and imperialism and colonialism, neocolonialism, patriarchy, and everything else, right? Because people are dying in mass numbers every day from economic and political neglect, imposition, exploitation, oppression. But it takes like the pandemic, right? And so again, something so spectacular and egregious to really to engage what is actually happening structurally. So that's just something else that I'm thinking about, because people were already suffering prior to the pandemic, and had the pandemic not happened, again, will we even be having this conversation? And so I don't necessarily know. I don't have any broad proclamations about that, but that's sort of what I'm thinking about. Even as I don't want to diminish what has happened. I don't think anything like that would happen in the United States, because we're approaching 600,000 too.
We passed it,
the parallels between Brazil and the U.S. on so many levels are like the rates of police brutality, they're really kind of uncanny. And so in thinking about Bolsonaro and Trump being in office at the same time and committing the same kinds of egregious atrocities, and also like, and what's your boy's name that was in the UK who Brexit? All three of them.
Oh, no. Boris.
Yes.
I want to say Boris Kojo. That's not. What is it? Two black Boris? What?
This Boris Johnson is definitely not Boris Kojo.
Okay. Right. I'm like, I know it wasn't him, but
yo, that's
what he get for being named Boris.
I know, but the three of them, they're the way they dealt with COVID is just a sort of furtherance of the way they were already existing in terms of governance and the way the state exists, right? And so like they're just the sort of, what do you call it, the most egregious kind of final outcomes of it. But then we just return back to business as normal, where the same shit is happening. People just go with a smile on their face.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about this later on in our interview with Olivia, but it's in direct contrast to the way that African governments handled the pandemic. South Africa notwithstanding, but the way that that these countries, the countries that are expected to collapse and to have the most deaths, actually handled it so much better. But because of the pervading dark continent approach, that was inconceivable that the West would be the ones fucking up on the sticks, and and Africa is actually handled it so much better. So.
But now Bolsonaro, we were talking about the parallels. I mean, the police in Brazil are even worse than in America. I mean, they have a shoot to kill order.
Colombia too.
Yeah. So yeah, we're talking about, I mean, even with the indigenous people, it wasn't just statements that were made like that. That's just a pretext, right? It's a precursor. But like, it was the major goal was to go into those lands and loot the resources from those lands. So yeah, I mean, he's. I think both of you are right as far as like the extreme example becomes something that everybody can become outraged about, right? When sanctions are killing people daily, but they're not as overt as a shoot to kill order, right? Or just completely looting the lands. But like I was saying, even with the indigenous lands, like there was a so-called department that was supposed to protect them, and it already sucked. He's just made it even worse. Like he doesn't even respect the veil of protection that was there, but they're not really being protected anyway. And the reason I believe that office came into existence is because in the 70s and 80s, people were just going in there and just slaughtering folks, right? So this is not anything new. So yeah, it's all part of a continuum. It's just sometimes people get in office that are maybe more gross expressions or more overt expressions of what's already happening.
And shifting from one shit show to another, I just wanted to speak a little bit about this whole Kyle Rittenhouse situation, right? That so I first read about this on AJ Plus, Al Jazeera Plus, where it was saying that the judge ruled in his case saying that lawyers can't call the people he murdered victims, but they can call them rioters, looters, or arsonists. So the judge said that the term victim was too loaded, but rioter, looter, and arsonist are not too loaded. And so this sort of relates to our failure to hold, or the outrage on the one hand about fascists and right wingers on the one hand, but the failure to stop their policy, because part of this is a product of the way that for at least the past 10, 15, 20 years, the right has been able to pack the judicial system with right-wing judges. And this is precisely a case in point, right? And so it's an interesting, not necessarily contrast, but it's interesting to put that judgment in conversation with somebody like Bolsonaro being finally held to some account, even if it's symbolic, even if it's just a first step. Whereas this person, who again is another fascist type, a white nationalist, whatever you want to call him, is not gonna be held to account because the judge is already pushing the trial in his favor, if that makes sense.
And even, I mean, it's implied, but I think it has to also be stated that issuing some sort of prejudice towards a language of victimization and behaving as if the language of riot or looter or whatever is not also loaded in another direction, right? It is a part of that logic that says that property is more important than people, right? This is the same thing that we talked about when Ferguson happened, when Baltimore happened. People are all up in arms, and I don't know how many times we have to have this conversation about people destroying their own communities, blah, 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 blah. How many times we have to have these conversations about the fact that no matter what, like people's lives are more important. And so even just in that very sort of maybe like slight rhetorical shift in framing, that there's so much loaded there that says, okay, now if you can understand these people who were killed as looters and rioters, then somehow their death is justified. But if you frame them as victims, then somehow we have to think about the fact that maybe their death was not justified, right? So I think all of those things, I mean, I think we know them implicitly, but I think that they also need to be stated very clearly in the framing of the trial.
Yeah, and I think, like we were just saying with Bolsonaro and the statements he made about the indigenous people, again, these things are a pretext to justify another action. So the first thing you have to do is dehumanize folks in some form, and then you can justify whatever happens to them. I mean, even when we think about the process of racialization, within racial capitalism or whatever, like the process was, these people are inhumane, and therefore we have justification to take their land, so forth, so on and so forth. So you see that play out even when it's white folks on white folks. That you still see that play out where it's like we're trying to uphold property rights at the end of the day, and we want to send a message. The state wants to send a message that is the precedent. That is what we care about, and we'll even sacrifice quote unquote our own, to do that. So no, it's not surprising. And it also, I think, whenever the state is kind of willing to take their foot off the pedal, but whenever the state is laxed on so-called white supremacists, and I put that in air quotes, or any type of so-called extremists, that sends a signal to, the folks who are ready to take it there that this now you have more bandwidth and opening to do so. That's a wink, wink. When the state comes down a little harder on them, it's to say, okay, we feel you, but we need to maintain a certain level of control and continuity here. But this judge is actually opening the door for, more quote unquote extremism. Again, we can get into so-called extremism, whether that's even a thing, but this judge is opening the door to the folks who are ready to take that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Oh, Too Black, about sending a message, but I don't know, because remember, as the Chauvin trial was happening, there was another police shooting that happened right down the street in some suburb of Minneapolis. And so I think that sometimes the way that because of the way that accountability operates vis-a-vis individualism, is that when the accountability happens, it makes it seem like it's an individual isolated incident, right? And so even when the state hands down some semblance of so-called justice, right, or is less terrible, it still doesn't necessarily send a signal, because the way that it's argued out is that this was a specific case, a quote unquote bad apple, etc. But I think that what you're pointing out is that they're not even feigning to care about, to even put on a valence of so-called justice. The other thing that I wanted to say about the victims is that they were white, but they were nigger lovers. And so they actually don't count, right? When you talk about dehumanizing, they were interracialists and nigger lovers. I'm writing about this in my book, so I'm thinking about it it's top of mind, but like, they're kind of failed whites, right? They're the ones that are really disposable in a particular way, especially vis-a-vis somebody like Rittenhouse, who like Ann Coulter and other people were like, Rittenhouse for president. Like, this is the guy I want, running the country, or whatever goofy shit they were saying. And so I think that that's important as well, that those whites, because they were participating in like a black protest or a black movement, like they don't count. They not white for real. So
no, I'm saying, when I say the state sending a message, I don't mean that. I mean, let me be more specific. Sometimes when vigilantes do things and they crack down hard on vigilantes, when they're sending a message that we'll take care of it, we don't need vigilantes to do it. When they don't crack down on vigilantes, when they do shit like this, that's a wink to say, yeah, keep going, go further. That's what I mean. Not the state itself is saying this is bad, or no. I'm saying it's a wink to vigilantes that you can take this further. Versus if they all were prosecuted and everybody went to prison, then that lets them know, like, okay, if we go out and do this, the state may not tolerate it in this form. Like I said, they might take care of it through their official apparatus. That's all I meant by that.
It's the same shit with the January 6th. I think I read something where it's like the black whatever stop the steal person who wasn't even at the January 6th insurrection got the toughest sentence of everybody, right? And so I think that it's the same type of thing, where that wink that you're talking about, they're telling these people like, it's cool, like, you'll get a slap on the wrist comparatively compared to what Black Lives Matter and other Black radical protesters get. It's like, it's cool. It is a wink and a nod to continue on, because they know, like, because as empire crumbles, they know they're going to need reinforcements, right? And so this sits alongside voter suppression and increased police murder and police brutality in our communities, et cetera. Like, all of this is part and parcel of that system of genocide.
So for our last little mini topic and shoot the shit, we are coming up on the 30-year anniversary of the Madrid Conference, which was essentially an attempt by the US government in conversation with Israel, Palestine, I think at the time, maybe Lebanon,
Egypt, I think,
Jordan, a few other Arab nations, to move forward in the sort of the Palestinian-Israel or Arab-Israeli conflict, right? And this happened in October 30th to November 1st of 1991, which then ostensibly led to the 1993 Oslo Accord, right? Which was, in effect, a peace treaty. But I think what's really interesting about where we are 30 years later is that We are nowhere.
Failed.
Right? Exactly.
Failure.
Right?
Or success, depending on how you see it, right? Depending on from whose perspective you're narrating.
Exactly. And I think part of what came up in that moment is that there was a belief that the US government was shifting its position on the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, not so much not in favor of Israel, but to a position that was maybe less hostile towards Palestine, right? And so what we see now is increasing hostility towards the Palestinian people, the continuation of genocide in Palestinian land. And so it really, I think, again, as a part of this kind of continuation of our conversation about sort of performative politics, it really sort of begs the questions about these peace conferences, these peace treaties, and whether or not these things are happening for sort of symbolic reassurances, knowing that the U.S. has never wavered in its support for Israel. Right? It has never prioritized the lives and the well-being and the condition of Palestinian people, and even this notion of anti-Semitism, right? Which is so misunderstood, because a Palestinian person cannot be anti-Semitic towards a Jewish person because they're Semite. Because first of all, Semite is a cultural linguistic category anyway, and they're also considered Semites, right? So even these kinds of conversations where we get on the left sometimes shut down for a particular kind of critique of Israel, right? Which is not a critique of Judaism, right? It is a particular kind of critique of a religious settler colonial project that was aided and abetted by the U.S. and Western Europe, right? And by the U.S. and Great Britain in particular. And so to think about where we are at this moment, I wonder what you all think about that or have to say about that.
Listen, I just feel like we went from three different contexts of genocide and statist failure, right, and statist aggression. And it's interesting that this happened sort of in the name of peace. I would not necessarily reconciliation, but peace and negotiation. But the question is always like, who is at the table for these conversations? They're not asking ordinary Palestinians. They might be asking some representatives. And there's a lot of critiques of even the Palestinian Authority by Palestinians on the ground.
In fact, at the time, Israel would not participate in the talks if representatives from the Palestinian Liberation Organization participated in the talks. So even in terms of
their own, dead on arrival.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even so, ordinary people are never part of these conversations, right? People who have the most at stake in the consequences and the outcomes are never at the table. And so we have to think very deeply about, and this, brings us to particular critiques of the limitations of the nation state, of these ideas of diplomacy that are ensconced in a hierarchical international order, and that completely, again, obfuscate or leave out what the actual material and social needs are of the people who are subjected to these sort of abstracted decisions. And so, I think what we're seeing today absolutely makes sense in terms of how this conference or how this meeting was set up, because it was in bad faith and it was never meant to be in the interest of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, the goal here is never peace, at least not in the way that we understand it, as so-called everyday people. The goal is never peace. The goal is maybe to control a situation for whatever particular agenda is arising at the time, and the state might need to calm something down for that matter, or the various states that are involved in this. But since the goal is never peace, then you're not going to get that, you know what I mean? So it's just like, and that's how all of this stuff functions. And then they'll use these things to say, hey, we did this, so get off our backs, and since most of us unfortunately are not politically educated enough, we see those things as sufficient. We'll be like, okay, they stopped killing each other for the moment, but they didn't, or they stopped ethnic cleansing, but they didn't. Like they just, it's just not on camera, or it's not front and center, because there's some stopgap in between. And that's what a lot of this stuff is. Because again, there's no money to be made in peace. There's no order to be had in peace, really, like in real peace. Like that doesn't work for the powers that be. I mean, peace would obviously benefit us, but I'm saying for them, there's no interest to even really push for peace outside of just a certain regulated form, so markets can continue to flow.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting correlation to our conversation that we've been having about genocide, right? Because these states are really invested in these technologies of death, right? And they're not invested in a kind of politics of the preservation of life.
Right.
Period.
All right, y'all, it's time for this week's planting thoughts. So our plant this week is a Peperomia obtusifolia, or a baby rubber plant. It is not in the family of the sort of bigger rubber plant. It's in the family of Peperomia. This particular plant is considered an air purifier. It is mostly ornamental. And one of the things that I like about this plant is that it is not a succulent, but it's succulent-like in that it has fleshy leaves, which is part of why it's used as an ornamental plant. But what I like about the fleshy leaves is that they tend to tell you what they need. So when this plant is needing more water, the leaves can shrivel up a bit, but not die. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about for life and the sort of changes that we go through. And to note that just because things begin to look a little bit different doesn't necessarily mean we need to get rid of them. Maybe we just need to give them a little more attention. So that is this week's plant for planting thoughts, baby rubber plant.
Y'all, I am so excited for our dope interview today. It is with our homegirl, Olivia Rutazibwa, and Layla will take it from here because Layla is who put me on.
I'm super excited. So you all may or may not know this, but Dr. Olivia Rutazibwa, oh, I wish I could remember the nickname we came up with.
The good reverend.
Yes, the Reverend Dr. Olivia Rutazibwa, also known as a pimp called Slickback. That's what.
Period.
That's what so I'm super excited about this interview today because Olivia and I met while I was on fellowship in South Africa. And we had the distinct honor and pleasure of being in lockdown together. And so there's nothing like making a friend when you can't go anywhere.
And that little side eye I just gave was for the extended South Africa fellowship, but we've worked past that.
Yes. So Dr. Olivia Rutazibwa is a Belgian-Rwandan international relations scholar and former journalist. She also continues to hold a senior research fellowship, a senior research associate position at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, where we met. She is currently an assistant professor in human rights and politics at the London School of Economics. She holds a PhD in political science and international relations from Ghent University. And following her doctoral training program at the European University Institute in Italy, and internships at the European Commission in Brussels and the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. Before joining LSE, she was a senior lecturer in European and International Development Studies at the University of Portsmouth in the South Sea, which she likes to make very clear. So we are so excited to have you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. So first, we just wanted to have you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your work. What are some of the sort of driving questions that animate your work? And what else do we need to know about you in general?
So I won't be able to tell everything you need to know about me, but I was thinking, because usually interviews are given in the wide world. And I was thinking, what would I share about myself in another venue like this podcast? So I'm very excited to be here. And I think maybe, yeah, as you mentioned, I am second generation Black person in Europe, specifically born and raised in Belgium, but of Rwandan heritage. And that kind of has influenced, I think, a lot of my interest, my professional interest apart from. So the distinction between professional activists, as we know, is blurry, but let's say scholar or intellectual interests, which would cover both, come from that actual biography. So I often start telling the story that I chose, I think, international politics or relations to study, because I remembered as a teenager, when the genocide happened in Rwanda, I was I don't know, 15, 16, but I was living it really like from far away, but also from very close by. So growing up in a white family in Belgium, but still with ties to my Rwandan family, I guess the most shocking was how different that same apocalyptic event was being lived. So on TV or in school or in history lessons, whatever, it was just like random Black people killing each other in Africa.
Yep.
I'm simplifying, but it kind of was, even in Belgium, former colonizer of Rwanda. But then on the other hand, from my family side, random family side, it was very much the end of the world. Like there's no other way to describe it. It was like profound. So, and then in the meantime, in school and also going to uni, I get like the UN, human rights, blah, blah, all these amazing inventions by the West. And we stand for that. And so it's always been this, yeah, it's way more than tension, but this discrepancy that amounts to extreme lies, I think, or the mythology of what we get in school, basically, about what actually happens in the world, and then also what we are being taught. So I guess the most shocking was the UN being there and then leaving on the eve of the genocide. So that was an additional thing, right? It was like in school they teach me the UN is this amazing thing. And then
the UN. You'll never forgive them for what they do.
Yeah, I was about to swear, but I'm like, this is too early. So
it's never too early to swear.
Never too early, but yeah.
Never.
But we all got the same, wherever in the world, even today, we have the same stupid handbooks that tell us a particular story about the UN, right? Unless we have access to different type of education. So long story short, and I say really long, because I do have a PhD, whatever, I can use a title doctor, but it took me 12 years a slave to do that. So it took me a really long time. And part of it was is that I felt like all of it is bullshit, but I do not have the tools to articulate that. So it is post and decolonial thought, in conjunction, I guess, with Black studies, that has allowed me to put an intellectually sounding label on the lies.
So what do you mean by decolonial thought?
So yeah, maybe to make it immediately super concrete. So in my PhD, I wanted to know when we deploy, I don't know, ideas of human rights or ethical foreign policy, and I was specifically looking at the European Union, the most boring institution you can choose on planet Earth, but that's what I did. And I really wanted to see, when do we, pull out the human rights card, the democracy card, the development card, when we engage with countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I started by doing all these different, I don't know, like a huge database, who was in the presidency of the EU, to then see if it was France, were they giving more or less attention to Mali or not? And I was expecting to find patterns, right? Very positivist approach. I'm not very good at statistics, but I took, again, in these 12 years, considerable amount of time to do that. But then I think in response to your question, once I think I started taking the post-colonial studies, but also decolonial understandings more seriously, I understood that my question was wrong. And it's not just positivist, post-positivist. It was very much, I was building on the assumption that more action by the EU, or even more consistent action by the EU, was a good thing in and of itself. But if you take the colonial seriously, then whenever Europe is around, it's not necessarily a good thing. So the question should be something else. Probably, should we be there in the first place? What happens in the absence of the international/Western community? And so I started to do some field work in Somaliland, because they had like a microsecond in their history where they were dealing with the same civil conflict as the rest of Somalia, but they just thanked the international community and said, we're gonna take it from here. You guys can come and do some demining stuff, but otherwise politically we'll sort it out. And so up until the present, even though the international community is back, that part of the Horn of Africa is visibly more stable. So, and again, I don't think it's a simple presence absence thing, but I just realized that we don't study Western absence seriously enough. And that comes from, I think, the colonial nature of how our sciences are built, that we assume that Western presence is a good thing.
Well, but when is there an absence, right? Because AFRICOM has filled that void, right? Eritrea is the only country in the African continent that doesn't have some relationship with AFRICOM. And so has there actually been, and if you think about structural adjustment, if you think about all these different sort of international relations, is there actually a Western absence that's significant in terms of like issues of sovereignty and development, right?
No, I think it's so I would never claim it like as a historical absolute, like to say like really from then to then nobody was there, because I don't think that ever since 1492 that has been a privilege of anyone, you know, to put it hyperbolically, but there are gradations, right? So I think Somaliland, who self-declared independent, meaning they're not recognized by anyone as a sovereign nation, that in itself is a weird form of creating an absence, because others will engage with you, but they cannot fully engage with you as a sovereign nation. That's one thing. But also they literally, you know, if you remember, I think our age group is kind of similar, but the movie Black Hawk Down, no, I say this when I say to my students, they're like, what? So, I realized I was old when I said that, but Black Hawk Down is South Central Somalia. So it's after the UN failing, the Americans coming in. At the same time, Somaliland said, do not come here. We do not need you. We are going to build on our own peace and reconciliation mechanisms that we have, even from pre-colonial time. That was not a pure moment in which there was no one, but it's to signal that they made a different choice, which makes that today, even when I was in Hargeisa, the capital, you see, I don't know, the little signs for any NGO that you can imagine possible, every single step that you take. But the way that they engage with the World Bank or the US or the UK is from a position of, at some point you were not there, but we managed to get our peace by talking to each other. And I would include Rwanda in that. So I was saying like how shocked I was at the international community leaving on the eve of the genocide. It's that same event. So in that sense, I'm not just celebrating absence as, you know, like this is what we should do. It's super cruel and 1 million people died, but it's that basis on which the Rwandan government today has much more power over the international community than in comparison to many others. Because whenever somebody tries to impose something, they're like, yeah, we were there, you were not there. So for me, intellectually, that's something I want to engage with, because it's not even about celebrating this or that government. It's about how insanely little we know about what happens when we're not there. And when I say we, in this case, I mean the West. And again, it's imagined, and the actors are not always clear cut, and the distinction even between West and non-West is not that clear cut either. But at least conceptually, I think a lot of our ethical thought is connected to a presence and doing something, rather than moving away, retreat, ethical retreat, or, you know, I think now we're getting somewhere by thinking through abolition, like stopping to do something. So that's, I think, where, that's what I got from decolonial thought today. And I didn't give the genealogy of the discipline or whatever, like if it's even a discipline, right? But this idea of thinking through the implications of taking the colonial seriously, but also what is it that we were trying to do with decolonization that goes beyond what we managed to do, maybe.
Yeah, I think that the question of ethical retreat is interesting, because I think it's one that, I don't know that we framed in that way, but it's something that we often argue in the context of Cuba and Venezuela, like this notion that the people themselves have the right, deserve the right, and to be sovereign and make decisions for themselves, and whatever those decisions may be, right, whether that becomes something that has further ramifications or whether it works out great, that is up to the people, right? That is something that we have to actually advocate for, regardless of what that sort of looks like in relationship to sort of Western powers, right?
Yeah. And even beyond, not beyond rights, but next to rights, I think a lot of what our scholarship needs unlearning is the fact that we can even imagine people's capacity to do so. So before even the right, like often the way we are being, like when we say we need to decolonize our canons and X, Y, Z, it's because embedded in those existing canons is the impossibility for us to even imagine that all peoples at all times, everywhere, are capable of imagining what they want. Mm-hmm. So that all of that has been eclipsed to then say, how can we help? It's not even a real question, but you know, that's where we often start, is from the other's incapacity to imagine what they need.
No, so like all of that is super interesting. And part of what you were speaking about reminds me of this, the way that exclusion is always the marker of thinking about international oppression, but how people like, Edom Getachew and Keeanga-Lamata Taylor talked about burdened inclusion. So this is sort of an inversion of that, how it's not how absence can actually, like it's both absence and presence have their own like set of issues, but they're two sides of the same coin when it comes to thinking about decolonization. But shifting gears just a little bit, you did an interview with Paul Gilroy, who, is big or whatever in like Black British cultural studies. But what was interesting about that interview, or something that I was thinking through as you were speaking to Paul Gilroy, was about monuments. And he was and how there was an uprising in Belgium, especially around the presences of statues to King Leopold, and how he was saying, those statues are coming down fast. And it reminded me, us of the monument wars that are happening in the United States and other places in the world. And I just wanted to get your perspective on this, because I'm quite ambivalent. I don't think that there should be monuments to any, on the one hand, I think leave that shit alone. Like the monuments to white supremacy show where we're at. And so when we erase them, it doesn't erase the structural and material conditions. It simply erases the sort of visceral markers of those. So whatever. At the same time, I don't believe in monuments at all. I don't think we should have the Rosa Parks shit, the fucking George Floyd, none of that, because I think that it's a boondoggle. And I think that those resources should go to the actual communities that representation is supposed to somehow include, or, or make feel human or whatever. And so, and it also seems like a lot of revolutionary energy now has to go toward tearing these monuments down. And I'm just quite ambivalent about the struggle over, the monument wars one way or the other. So like, what is your perspective on this, and sort of what, I guess, what is the sort of decolonial or radical potential in pushing back against these monuments, but also what might be some liberalism maybe sneaking into the back door when it comes to these sort of struggles over monuments and this sort of thing?
Great question. I would say that the shortcut answer would be, for me, monuments, but in Belgium and the Netherlands, we also have the whole Black Pete thing. So it's all, representational stuff, right? Yeah. I would say being able to part with them for the white majority is the minimal condition for them to be able to signal that they're serious about anything to do with anti-racism or decolonial something. So that's where I put the value in it, but it's not a sufficient one. So then the second part of your question, like as revolutionary thinkers, actors, whatever, how much energy do we put in there? For myself, I find that, let's say for the last 25 years, I've been trying to explain to white Flanders that Black Pete is racist, that Leopold should not be a name of a square, a name of a street, a statue standing there, whatever. And the reason why I do so is because I think it immediately allows us to check how serious they are, because a lot of the thing that we fight in the conversation with the white world is white innocence, as explained by, for instance, someone like Claudia Becker. It's this idea that because I did not mean to be racist, I'm not racist. And then all the energy that is being sucked out of us is to explain to them that, oh, you're not a bad person, but X, Y, Z, this happened. So for me, statutes then is to say immediately, like, if you can explain to me why a statute for you is more important than the poverty statistics of color that we have in this country, or that a stupid Black Pete's tradition that really is about giving gifts to children the same way that Santa Claus does, that's more important to you than people drowning in the Mediterranean, then you have an entry point to have an actual conversation about anti-racism. That if we do not do that, it's very difficult to do so. So that would be for me, like in terms of conversation with the white world, and especially the white progressive world, because surprisingly, there's so much resistance to taking down those stupid statutes, or to even pluralizing whatever, any canons that we have, because people think that we're canceling. We know that we're not going to do cancel culture, but people see it as cancel whatever. Next to that, even if we cancel out, let's say the white concerns about this, or our engagement with the white world, it's for me, there are markers in terms of how we narrate our own existence on this planet, and it's a shared existence, right? So as long, for me, like a statute is always a celebration of something. A street name is a celebration of something. So if I and my children, my nieces, my nephews, whatever, have to keep on living in a place where there is an overt celebration of people that have killed our people, I think it is a valid thing to fight. Because again, it is connected to how people imagine the disposability of our lives or not. And that brings us back to the poverty statistics or dying in the Mediterranean. I'm taking many shortcuts, right? But so for me, this is the connection between, you know, the epistemic level of this and then the concrete material one, but it is deeply connected. It's just that it's super humiliating. And that's where I share your reticence to actually do it. It's humiliating for me to fight for recognition through a stupid Black Pete discussion, or stupid statute discussion, or stupid XYZ discussion. But
oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So there's two sort of like contradictions, right? One is that the problem with white liberalism. So I think that the conversation you're making, I think, is sort of geared toward perhaps conservatives who are like, fuck that, you're not taking our shit, whatever, right? And so there's one level of whiteness that needs to be challenged, but the problem is that the means become the end, right? So if it is like getting rid of statutes and means to talk about broader structural issues, with white liberalism, that becomes the project itself. So literally getting rid of the statutes becomes their sort of anti-racist bona fides, right? They don't have to do anything else. And so there's not a further conversation. And so I wonder about that. And secondly, I think that on the one hand, yes, like, you know, building names and monuments are celebrations of whatever glory lost, but they're also markers. They also tell us exactly where we are. And so my concern is that if it is that that getting rid of those names without getting rid of the sort of the structures and material realities that they actually represent, that gives there's a sort of a false kind of equivalence or a false sense of progress there, whereby if we get like, you know, we've gotten rid of these names and therefore that's the work. And I get like, right, you need to sort of, you don't want to celebrate, so in the context of the United States, like Robert E. Lee and all these people, but at the same time, the very fact that they are there tells us something about what freedom dreams need to be and what the struggle needs to be. And if we get rid of those, how easily we forget, especially in the American context, where so much shit is already ahistorical and very sort of vapid. So anyway, so I just wonder about those two contradictions.
No, I think those are valid points. So that's why I started with minimal rather than sufficient condition. Maybe I didn't finish the sentence. And so minimal condition, for me, that's a reflection that we as activists or scholars need to have. That we can engage in that, but never make the mistake like the liberals would, that is a sufficient thing. It's a minimal one. And then in terms of the erasure, like by taking them down, we don't have to like stuff them away. I'm happy to put them in a museum or somewhere else. Like it's not even about, but it's about the difference between marking something and remembering, and we also have history books for that, whatever. And having them still in a place of celebration in 2021, which is a square name, which is statue in the middle of the city. And I think that there is an actual, there's a profound distinction between taking those, you know, genocide celebratory people, taking them from our main squares of any city we live in and put them in a museum. I think there is something important there, because and that can be just for us. Like it doesn't even need to involve white liberals, right? Like I think we can demand that for us. I don't want to explain to my niece what this person is.
Mhm.
And I can take her to a museum so that it's like a siphon of time that we've chosen to engage with a painful past. And I'll tell her about Leopold and all of that.
Mm.
It's different than if her address is Leopold Street, whatever.
Mm.
See what I mean? So that's what, but another thing about the white conservatives versus liberals, and I think sometimes we overestimate how much of the pushback does not just come from the conservatives in that sense, right? So it is especially those self-proclaimed white liberals that, if they're honest, initially they had huge problems with the statutes and whatever, and now like whatever they cut up, but in Belgium it's a bit slower. So for me, it's just in general people that consider themselves so fundamentally as not racist, that feel that their being is being attacked because we're there to touch Leopold. And I'm like, honestly, but if your being
Fuck Leopold. I just want to take that for the record.
no, honestly, but it's so profound. It's like and I think that's, again, for our own safety, for our own survival. That for me, that's the difference I have to the white majority, is not to placate them, but it's just like there's so many of them and they have so much power.
Yeah,
there's some entry points that we need to do there, but I would never think that once we got rid of the statutes, we've done the work. It's at best it's a precursor to the actual work, but it also shows how much space there is for the actual work. Because if you can't convince them that Leopold was a motherfucker, then how are you going to convince them that the housing policies that they have are actually discriminating against our people? You know, so that's those things are connected, because they still think that they did nothing wrong and nothing is wrong, and as long as they have good intentions, it's fine.
Period.
Well, shifting gears a bit more. I mean, there's just so many different things we can talk about. You have such a wide range of interests, and I hesitate to use the word expertise because I know we always sort of push back against expertise.
Specialization.
Yes.
Bundle hierarchies.
Yeah. So recently, just in July of this year, you co-authored a piece, An African Reading of the COVID-19 Pandemic and the Stakes of Colonization. And one of the things that struck me in this particular piece, because, you know, so July of last year, I released a piece, The Pandemic of Racial Capitalism. And some of the things that were interesting to me were the conversations that you had in the piece about what the initial responses to the pandemic were in the African context. And so in the case of Venezuela and Cuba, a part of what I argued was that there was a sort of a pushback against these sort of technologies of death, right? And that these sort of socialist logics push towards a very different approach to responding to the pandemic very early on. In this piece, I want to read a short paragraph from it. You say, by March 2020, it became clear that the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was global and that no country would be immune. On the 11th of March, the World Health Organization declared the national coronavirus outbreak a global pandemic. African governments, conscious of the fragility of their own health systems and witnessing apparently advanced health systems cave in under the pressure of the outbreak, responded swiftly to prevent the worst. Ghana, for example, recorded the first case of COVID-19 on March 12th. By March 24th, there was one death and 24 positive cases in the country. On that same day, the government announced the closure of land, sea, and air borders to all inbound passengers except for citizens returning home by air who were required to quarantine under surveillance in government-approved hotels for 2 weeks upon arrival at the international airport. Rwanda, a country of 12 million people with a universal healthcare structure, implemented a lockdown shortly after the first detected case of COVID-19 on March 8th. The government also introduced a program to supply 20,000 households with free food through a social protection scheme. Ethiopia, one of Africa's largest countries with over 100 million people, declared a state of emergency, postponed highly anticipated elections, and closed borders, but did not implement a lockdown of movement in the country. Then you go on to say, if we compare this to the UK, which went into lockdown on March 23rd after recording 335 deaths, and more than 6,500 confirmed cases, we see differences in reaction times. Many other African countries also responded in a timely manner to the outbreak. The few isolated exceptions were the leaders of Burundi and Tanzania, who tried to deny the reality of the threat at the beginning of the pandemic, but have both ultimately died, and that the suspicion is that they maybe have died of COVID-19. And so I'm interested in thinking about the arguments that you make about why African countries maybe responded this way early on, and also some of the broader arguments you make about an opportunity to think differently, not only about healthcare and healthcare structures, but about sort of relationships of governance in the African context in the wake of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so I wrote that piece with my my colleague and friend Cesar at Twitter, and he's at the University of Legon in Ghana. And he's actually if I'm honest, I was a bit apprehensive because we have in the title, you know, an African perspective, and, you know, like, you know, being firmly located, obviously in the West, African descent, everything you want. I was thinking like, what can my contribution be in such a conversation, which I think was really important to center the African experience. And both you, yeah, Layla and me, we were in South Africa when this whole shit show started. And it's true, like it did something that made me, for instance, be very critical of a lockdown as a blanket, you know, policy for the whole planet, knowing that some people would die of the lockdown rather than the numbers of COVID infections, right? So that's why in the piece, I focus mostly on the conceptual things around, you know, what would it actually mean to take decolonization seriously in a conversation about global health in the actual present moment of COVID-19, but also specifically building on the experiences and the reactions on the African continent. So what you just read was, I'm not sure if I'm gonna guess or not guess, but what I felt, if I compared, I think some of the things we saw being in South Africa, but then also what we described in the article, but then also afterwards being in the UK, is that it's almost like a moving object of the disposability of certain lives, but also certain experiences with pandemics or epidemics, right? And I think something that when I mentioned before that we always have a hard time to even imagine or conceptualize people's agency or insight or capability to do stuff, what we often forget is that when it comes to expertise about pandemics, I think the African continent is one of the ones, right?
Ebola and all of the, yes.
Exactly. So I think that would be a first answer. They literally, it happens more often there and it's been solved more often there against all the odds of structural adjustment policies having utterly destroyed the public health systems that could have been there and probably could have saved many more lives, right? In comparison to the UK, early on, the people that were designated as disposable were the elderly people and were the people of color that were actually providing all the, you know, the frontline workers, whether it's health, whether it's supermarket, all of that. So those are
already otherwise weakened sick people.
Exactly. So the 300,000 plus people that died.
The blacks wouldn't get it until they did. It's like first it was like the blacks is cool, and then it was like it's the blacks. They don't want to get vaccinated. They go get that shit, etc.
It's true.
Can't win. It's a lose-lose for the blacks.
It's true.
Yeah. So they kept like clapping for the NHS, which is, you know, the national health system here in the UK. So there was a lot of hypocrisy on, oh, we're so grateful for you, forgetting that most of the people that work for the NHS, which has been underfunded every year more and more, are people from the global South coming to work in the UK and dying first in this pandemic. But back to the African continent, I think it's a proximity, I think, to mass death that made them choose certain.
Related to this conversation in this article, I think that one of the things that you mentioned is that there was because the West was dealing with its own sort of economic and political and health crisis, there was a sort of turn away from a type of humanitarian or imposed logic on the continent, which offered up an opening, perhaps, right? And side note, interestingly, that's actually a hypothesis in like world systems analysis and development. So like Cardozo and all these people, they argue that during times of crisis and when the most development has happened in the global South, precisely in Latin America, because the West, the ties loosen. And then when the West rebounds, so like times of war, for example, this has happened. And then when the West rebounds, this is when, for whatever reason, right, for some mysterious reason, development is arrested again. And so this is sort of, that's the like, quite the arguments about development and underdevelopment. And okay, now, but my question is about, perhaps for the state, there's an opening, right? There's a different way that the African leaders or the African state might operate their own sort of public health apparatus outside of the West. But what does that actually mean for real people? If we're talking about that as a potentially decolonial moment, there's really no trickle down justice. There's really no trickle down sort of decoloniality. And so even if the state is able to turn away from the West in a particular way and assert some sovereignty and autonomy, what does actually existing decoloniality mean for regular people? Because oftentimes, if there is a turn away, for example, that often means a cut in aid, a cut in particular financial resources, which has a direct impact on people. And so that autonomy or that self-determination or sovereignty is a double-edged sword. And so if the nation state is always already entrapped in this sort of internationalist capitalist logic, decolonialism or decoloniality might mean, or self-determination might mean something for the state that doesn't mean the same thing for the people as such. And so I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. So when I was listening to you speaking, I was thinking we're actually coming back to the point we were trying to make before about retreat or absence, right? Because in a way, when the West is in trouble, they're looking elsewhere. It feels like parts of the world can breathe and maybe think of something else. And I think what we wanted to do with the paper was not necessarily make the claim that that's actually what happened in the last year and a half on the continent, but that when everybody's talking about decolonization as the new fashionable blah, and when we see what's actually happening on the ground, that if we bring those two together, at least at the level of imagination, what would it need to look like, right? And so to your question, what could it look like? I'm wondering to the extent that it's a question about the state or the nation state, but I can answer it in that respect as well. But I do think the same way that that coloniality or the colonial intervenes at the level of cognitive empire and the material extraction or imposition of one way of being, one way of knowing, one way of global health. I do think that decolonization also somehow plays on both levels. And part of what we argue in the paper is to say that we need to radically rethink how we understand health and well-being, and not that we need to reinvent it, nor that we need to, I don't know, like it's not even that obscure. The only thing we need to do is to stop the imposition of one understanding of health,
right,
that we have marketized into pharmaceutical monsters that we are dealing with today, where we have like 4 choices of random vaccines, whatever. That just the market aspect of it, but then obviously also the educational aspect of it. So when we organize degrees of medicine, like I think honestly, like East Asia, parts of India probably as well, is really one of the few places where you actually have organized at university level alternative forms of health education, right? So, and I think but we have the same realities on the African continent. People engaged with their health and their well-being, which is already not a division between body and soul and mind. But we often like say, oh, that's like witchcraft or this or that, or so it's about that. That's what I mean with the cognitive aspect of it. Like, how do we revalorize our different understandings of well-being? And then often people ask like, oh yeah, but how do we systematize this? Or how do we, and again, I think systematizing, I'm not all against it, but I also think it's again, only one way of knowing, and it's a very colonial one. So it's the desire to just decide for everyone on this planet, this is what health is. This is what have us die today. It's not because we don't have the vaccine, it's because the vaccine is not available to everyone. if we weren't into vaccines, right? But it's also because we don't have a billion other options that could also work. Like, I don't think that the 5 vaccines we have today are the only ones that can save us from COVID. And we know that we have other knowledges there that we have not developed in that sense, right? So that's where I think, of course, it involves the state and organizing at state level, especially when it's about degrees and all of that. But at the much more individual level, it's about how do we valorize what we already know or maybe have forgotten? And how do we organize as peoples around that as well? But also, how do we engage with the marketization? So that's a capitalist story of access to health, right? And so when I think very concretely of this microsecond that the West was so engulfed in itself that it didn't look elsewhere, where you could see, like, and we say in the article, so like really tiny examples of alternative whatever, that has been quickly superseded now by French or other parliamentarians saying, oh, we've just like sent 1 million doses there, 1 million doses there, whatever. Like they're handing out shit that was never theirs to give out to begin with, right? So for me also, it helps to think about what is fundamentally wrong with the idea of aid, is that you're giving something that you stole, you repackage it, and then you give it back, you give it as aid. And the same with vaccines. It was never yours to begin with. You should not have hoarded it, but also you should not have had intellectual property rights and patents. And so if you don't have any of that, there's nothing for you to give. The only thing you can do is move aside, produce your own, and make sure you're not like hampering others to save their own people. So that would be my point about, I think, self-determination. It's not sufficient to just say, let's reproduce that type of nationalism for ourselves. And I think often autonomy and self-determination has been misunderstood as that. It's on the one hand from the Western side to stop the imposition, and then from the other sides, the different ones, to say, what does our life and survival look like if we don't think that we depend on only them to do so? But that's why, for me, even though the article focuses on the African context, it will always be a question of global health. Not a unitary one, but it will always be one that it goes beyond Africa. It's just that we are the sites where the imposition is the most extreme or the most explicit.
So I want to maybe continue this conversation about ways of knowing, but kind of zoom out. So I know that your sort of broader work is dealing with, I think the last iteration that I understood of your book project, the part of the title was against epistemicide, right? And so one of the ways that you are thinking about coloniality and the pushback against coloniality is thinking about sort of genocide, ecocide or ecocide, and epistemicide. And so I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about the project that you're working on to think about what it means to work against epistemicide, and particularly a particular kind of Black epistemicide. And I wonder if maybe you can also bring in, you know, I think maybe we mentioned it in your bio, but your pre-academic life, you were a journalist. And I know you did some work in Burkina Faso, among the Burkinabe people, and thinking about the sort of legacy of Thomas Sankara. And so this question about ways of knowing what we know, what's remembered, what's not remembered, what's disremembered, is really interesting to me. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your sort of broader project and the work that you're doing against epistemicide.
Yeah. So that book project's become mythical to the extent that it's been many years. I'm going to try to keep it under 12 years. But, yeah, so the draft title, part of it that I have now, is On the Ruins of Epistemicide, right? And the reason why I use the ruins is somehow to, and it's something I heard recently, and I don't know our colleague's name, but it was a roundtable at JIS in South Africa, and to the point of epistemicide, she was saying that it's not that the knowledges have been killed, it's that we need to dust them off. And I think there is something quite powerful there that, like, even though if I think of my own trajectory, I just feel like so much that I was deprived of. I often think also, luckily, education in Belgium is almost free, but I feel like I've been cheated out of an actual education. I went to really good schools and all of that. But it's how can we avoid the fatal impact thing, like, oh, colonialism happened, hence we've been cut off from all our knowledges. I don't think we have, but we've been like, I don't know, made complicit in the absolute, I don't know, the amnesia, right? But amnesia means that it's still there. So I think that that's a tiny nuance that I'm trying to work through, which is about remembering rather than reinventing or something like that. So I guess that's the feeling I had also, you know, while doing the PhD, thinking about this, you know, how engaging with decolonial, post-colonial thought just brought me to radically different questions to which I had no answer, right? And that's what I'm going to sit with for the rest of my life. It's like, I'm at least asking different questions and, you know, what do I need to do to get, again, access to them? And if you mention my pre-academic life, and it was actually during the 12 years. Yeah. I use that loosely, but during the 12 years, for that, I worked for a couple of years as a journalist. So it was in the middle, me struggling with what the hell am I going to say about EU and human rights, because it's phony. I don't know what to say about it. And so I was Africa Desk editor. And at some point I was, it was a magazine that was very closely related to NGO world as well. So I'm being invited by an NGO, which is important. So the magazine I work for is amazing in the sense that they allow us to do slow journalism, whatever. The whole financial setup of the magazine is money from the government, the media ministry, but also culture, whatever, but also the international development side of ministry, but then also NGOs, they chip in, and then the private subscriptions, right? So it's a very interesting economic model, which makes that I can go to Senegal and for the elections and be there for 2 weeks, the week before and the week after, while my colleagues from the Belgian TV come for 3 days and, you know, whatever, like it's very in and out. But in terms of Burkina Faso, it was, there was the FESPACO, the film festival, which is every 2 years. And so we had like a cultural NGO in Belgium that invited certain journalists to come with them to see their projects. And so that's the context in which I go there. But then I always have to explain to my editor-in-chief what kind of story you're gonna bring when you're gonna go there. And I was like, yeah, Burkina Faso, I know where it is. I know they speak French. I don't know that much about it. Like, in full honesty, this is 2011 or 10. And so I decided to ask my dad, Rwandan dad, my friends, Rwandan friends in Brussels or whatever, like, I'm like, okay, so game of association. I say Burkina Faso, what comes to mind? All of them said Thomas Sankara. So everybody answers Thomas Sankara, whatever. And then I remembered, again, to the point of remembering and not everything ever being like completely canceled out, that it's true. My dad, when I was younger, used to mention him, but you know how parents say stuff and you're like, whatever, like, I don't know, I did not necessarily like register it. So I go to my editor-in-chief and I say, I'm going to bring a story about the spirit of Thomas Sankara in the streets of Ouagadougou in 2011. He's a good leftist Marxist. So he's like, I actually know who the guy is. And I had full admiration, but you have to explain to me why in 2011, a random person in Flanders would be interested in that story. And I said, I think I have two answers. The first one would be that in your imagination of Flanders reading this today, you might have only white people. I said, but all the people I asked are also part of that Flanders and they want to read that story. So that's, I think, and secondly, I said it was not very long after the economic financial crisis, 2008-9, also Greece crumbling, whatever. I said, the little I know about this guy for now is that he managed to do amazing stuff in his country in a super short amount of time, amongst which was food security, but also, you know, types of self.
They made their own clothes. The minister stopped driving Mercedes-Benz. They stopped flying first class. He was like, we all gonna get there at the same time.
Exactly.
So
I said, this is
about like 2 years, right? Like,
and he was like, fuck the World Bank. He was like, we ain't got it.
Exactly.
And then he managed to be cute and swaggy and charismatic all at the same time. So yeah.
So I kept it more professional than that. I just said we are in a moment in history, yes, where Europe has a lot to learn from the forgotten histories of the African continent, especially because we're trying to push structural adjustment onto Greece. And we have so many places in Africa that show us that that need not work. And Thomas Sankara is a really concrete example of that, right? So the guy was very cool. And he said, like, no, those are two really good answers. So that's how I ended up going to Ouagadougou and doing these street interviews. And then, you know, like the snowball, whatever. So you end up in people's houses. And we also ended up going to his parental house with some, you know, hip hop artists, but I just remember thinking the whole time, apart being super excited about the details, it's just like, how the fuck did I end up studying for so long? And this guy did not cross my path in my academic and scholarly work. And so since then, I mean, and other people have done it as well, but like a lot has changed. Like me and my colleague at LSE, for instance, we have now weeks that we're teaching Sankara. And nobody's stopping us. I did the same at Portsmouth as well. At the International Studies Association conference, you know, there are panels around him. So things are changing, but again, it's the idea of epistemicide, where things are being killed off, but when they're not really, like epistemicide is never fully successful, but it's successful enough to be so deeply harmful that our own knowledges are being deployed for our own demise in a way. It's, I don't know how to say that.
What does it mean to be a European as an African, a Rwandan, a decolonial scholar, and however else you might identify?
Global Black person.
A global Black, you feel me? A Sakarite.
When we were talking about this question, which you can or can, you know, don't have to necessarily speak to, but the interesting ways that ties into the special kind of predicament of Black folks in the US who have this kind of long, tenuous relationship, both with belonging and not belonging to the US and to the African continent, right? And so there are some interesting parallels there that I think make that question really interesting.
No, I think it's a really good question. I think the reason why I'm more and more engaging in that is that I see how ideas around identity are being misused, you know, in many different sides. Because when we say identity politics, we actually mean a political standpoint, right? It's
so that's identity reductionism. Word to Erica. What up, Erica? I know you in the chat. But identity reductionism versus identity politics, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But so often people just like bring out this label identity politics as this negative thing. All of us on this call know identity politics is actually a tool of liberation to some, right? Like, but the thing is, in Europe today, the whole woke blah, that all the shit that we have to deal with is in a way, and it comes at us from many different angles, unfortunately, not just like the white liberals, but a way in which we are forced to somehow have a static label of something, which is apolitical in its most like profound way. So the way I've been thinking more, I think about my own something, let's not call it identity, it's for me, it's relational. And that means that it shifts over time, but also that it shifts depending on who I have in front of me. So when I say I'm European, that is something that comes out mostly, I guess, when I am in Rwanda, for instance, where I deeply feel that I feel most not comfortable, but I read people best when I'm in the West. And it's a really sad thing to say, but it just is. I know how to behave. I know how to read. I know how to read the distinction between Germany, Italy, France, the US, and the UK, and Flanders. All these different nuances I have, like, that's my life, right? So that's why I would never disavow to be a European or Western person, because that just is. At the same time, to signal that I think I don't even have the luxury, even if I didn't choose it, to just be white European is just simply how I look, but also my background, like where my roots are, but then on top of that is a political choice to actually identify with how I look. And that is something, that's why I brought in time, that has come over time, because if you had met me we probably wouldn't have been friends. But if you had met me when I was 17, I still needed convincing that racism was a thing, that if you did not work hard, you could avoid it, stuff like that, right? So deeply socialized in a white mentality that today I can actively repudiate. So the thing that I think I'm trying to fight against is on the one hand to have a fixed identity that does not shifts and changes, but also one that does not want to take up legitimacy before doing anything, right? And so it would be so easy for me in a Western context to say, oh, I'm so African that whatever I say, I'm going to be more right than you. That's lazy identity, not politics, but identity shit.
Reductionism.
Exactly. And so that's when I say, I'm random Belgian or random European or, Afro-European or any of the labels. I don't even care what label we use, but it's about using your positionality, not as positionality, oh, I'm a white woman with white privilege, blah, 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 but positionality as relationality. That means that whomever you have in front of you, you have different political responsibilities, but also positions. And so there are places in the world where I feel more or less Black, and there are moments in time that I feel more or less Black. And often the most tangible way for me then to feel Black is both Black as a political identity, but also very concretely as random. And it's both in different times, not even at the same time, but both in different times. It depends who I have in front of me. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and I understand that positionality, but you all also know my pushback in terms of the way that I identify, right? And so I actually think that there is something to the category of African or Black, right? That supersedes those. It supersedes national territory, it supersedes ethnic belonging, but it is about a particular kind of subject experience, right? And so, like, for me, the way that I was raised, I've always identified as African, right? And that there's no need to then say, oh, but where, I don't know where in Africa I'm from, where I might be, what ethnic group might be, but because that category of being African is something that comes into being at a particular moment in time with a particular kind of relationality. And I think that that's also the type of work that's being done with Black, right? And so I think, you all know, I identify as an African who was born and raised in the US, right? I don't identify as American, whatever. And I think that that's important, right? I do think it's important to locate yourself. I think it's important to be true to what your experience is. And I understand it in particular in your context as a person who has a more direct connection to what particular place or time you might have come from, and the way people read you too, right? Based on your phenotype, all those different things. And so, I mean, all of these things are interesting and complicated, but I do think that it's an interesting question to kind of continue to mull over and to think about what it means for our sort of broader politics.
Is it American when I'm in Europe, when I realize how fucking tacky and rude I am and how weak the dollar is? I'm like, I'm fucking American.
And when you don't have an accent.
Yeah, I don't. And also, when I realize I don't have an accent, that's,
I will not be gaslit in this moment.
But even in the United States, I realize that. But don't start no shit, won't be no show. I
had a serious question for Layla though. So I agree with you. I think like part of the identity discussions that we have, part of it is, like I said, not just a political choice and not just choice, but also a commitment. Maybe let's call it that, because, you got it from home, but you could have like parted with it or not, so it's a political commitment. Is there anything about you claiming Africanness that shifts when you're on the continent? Or is it, and I'm not saying yes or no that it disappears, but
you lose your mother like Sadia because somebody called you O'Bruni.
or in Latin America or in Europe, whatever, right? But I'm just trying to imagine the same thing I was saying about relationality, that it shifts maybe who you have in front of you. I'm always more careful. I will always still call myself African, and the first to call me African would be my fellow Africans on the continent, but the way that I would like inhabit it would be more cautious, because I would be like, yeah, let me not do the, I happen to look Black, hence I'm like as African as you are kind of thing.
Epidermal capital.
You know what's interesting about this question is that and I don't know if it's because of the way that I present myself, the way that I engage. I have not had in my experience on the continent, right, which not have been everywhere, right? So I've spent time in Guinea, Conakry, and spent time in South Africa. So I am clear to tell people, yes, I was born and raised in the US.
Yeah.
Yes, as many generations as I have direct knowledge of were born and raised in the US, but I don't identify that way. And now, perhaps because I've been in political spaces with people who understand that positionality, I've not had the same type of pushback. And so, like when I went to Guinea, that was working with other people who were affiliated with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. That was a political understanding that wasn't, GC was not pushed back against.
Yeah.
But there's also a weird, interesting thing that happens to me that we've talked about too. I never get read as US.
I always get read.
It's like, I don't,
US.
because the thing is, even when people ask me, where are you from? I'll say I was born and raised in the US. And then the second question, and it happened to us the other day. The second question will be, so where are your parents from?
Yeah.
Because slaves. Like, what do you want me to say?
So it happened to us in a shop here in Amsterdam just yesterday. I think the shop owner he was Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked us where we were from. We said the US. And then he said, but are your parents from Ghana? Yeah. And so, and we said, maybe way back, we don't know.
Might have been Ian or might have been Biafra.
But, and that, I told you all that same thing happened to me in the Dominican Republic. People ask me, but your people got to be from Haiti.
Yeah.
So everywhere I go, even when I tell people that I'm from the US, something about me, I don't know what it is, gets read as not their understanding of what US American is.
But you yourself, does your understanding of your own Africanness shift wherever you are?
No, because I'm not arguing that I'm Igbo or that I'm Zulu or that I'm,
And it's so political. It's such a orientation.
Yeah.
Well, that's something I was curious about. That's
it. It doesn't. And then, people, the thing is, you want to see somebody who's really adamant about it, as my dad. Like, people will keep asking, and they will ask me, well, where are you from? I'm from Africa. And they say, well, where? I'm from Africa. I'm from Africa. I mean, it's uncompromising. Mm-hmm. Like, and so me, like, I'll probably give in even a little bit more than my dad, as in, like, I'll say where I was born or whatever. My dad won't even do that.
Yeah, I would say the main thing that shifts for myself is whether I say Black or African. I think that does shift depending on where I am, because mostly it's just Black, but then I'm very intentional about, especially about identifying as African in the US, because our folks be like, well, but yeah, so I think I use them relatively interchangeably, but Black is my go-to, even above African, just because I just feel Black as fuck, like I'm from the zone and I'm being, like, period, like, you know what I mean? That's just like, so
I think for me it's
Black I identify, but African American I will never use.
Never. I only say African American if I'm describing my ethnicity in contradistinction. If I'm talking about a particular dynamic in the US versus like Caribbean, African, whatever, I'll say I'm African American in terms of my ethnicity, but I will never say I'm an African American. I say Black, bitch, I'm Black. Period. Or African.
Period. Yeah, for me, I think I use Black and African to mean different things, but I'm both. Like that, there's no, and I'm also European and Flemish. And I live in the UK, and
you speak 17 languages.
I just want everybody to know that Flemish and Dutch are the same language, but the distinction is between like the King's English and American English. Learn that from Olivia. Learning, living, growing, all that, period.
If you want to get interesting perspectives on the world, get you a friend that's a polyglot, okay?
Yes. Yes. R.I.P. Paul Robeson.
South Sea. With my pink cup.
Yes. Well, rose gold everything. That's Olivia. Well, we want to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. This interview has been fun and informative, and hopefully our audience will enjoy it.
Yeah, and you'll be back. There'll be various issues we need to discuss. You'll be back. This is the first of many.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
All right. right, y'all. So we are introducing a new segment, Live from the Streets. And for our first edition of Live from the Streets, we have friend of the show, big homie Salifu Mack, here to report on the Spirit of Mandela Tribunal. Salifu Mack is a Pan-African socialist and member of the Black Alliance for Peace, the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and the Low Country Action Committee, which is a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Low County of South Carolina. So welcome.
Welcome.
Hey y'all, what's up? What's up?
Hey, thank you so much for being here. So you know what? We are going to hop right in.
What exactly is the Spirit of Mandela Coalition? And like, what's the ideal that they're trying to get across, just for people who don't have any reference point to it?
For sure. So, first of all, appreciate y'all having me to come through and talk about this. So the Spirit of Mandela Tribunal took place this past weekend. So what was that, the 22nd through the 25th in New York. So I left South Carolina, went up to New York for a few days for that. And what it was essentially was this year in December will be 70 years since the I guess the original We Charge Genocide proclamation that took place with like Paul Robeson. And so what this tribunal was sort of in the spirit of that, right? So just to sort of give some context, I guess, for people who don't understand what a tribunal is, think about it sort of like as a hearing, like some sort of like court hearing, but tribunals are as old as any sort of indigenous society that you can think of. As long as people have sort of been alive and been in society or community with each other, we've been finding ways to sort through our disputes, sort through conflicts, sort of that kind of thing. So in this instance, the people who are sorting through a thing are Black, brown, indigenous people here in the United States, so-called United States, and coming together to charge the US with genocide against its African, indigenous, and other populations, right? So the way it works is that you invite the accused party to defend themselves, and they can come if they want to. If they don't show up, that's all right, because business carries on anyway. And in this instance, no representative from the United States showed up. But like I said, the show kind of goes on. So the tribunal is responsible for putting together its own jury, because we know that here, Black people, rarely ever are we judged in American courts by our own peers. And so what this jury did was, for the Spirit of Mandela, they kind of extend the definition of peers in a way that I thought was really interesting. So this is an international jury of peers. So we're talking about people from South Africa, Eritrea, Haiti, the Wampanoag nation here on Turtle Island, all over. I think it was like 13 panelists being, defined as our peers, which kind of reframes this idea of like Black Americans as some distinct group separate from the world, and kind of really practices that internationalism that I think a lot of us have been trying to bring back here in the US. And what happens is over the course of what happened was, over the course of 2 days, witnesses, experts across the spectrum, from academics to political prisoners, were invited on stage to basically testify to the 5 charges that were being brought against the US. And the 5 charges were racist police killings of Black, brown, and indigenous people, hyper incarcerations of Black, brown, indigenous people, political incarceration of our political prisoners, environmental racism and its impact on us, and public health racism as well.
Thank you so much for that rundown. So We Charge Genocide is near and dear to my heart. So for people who don't know about that petition, the full name is We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. And it was prepared by the Civil Rights Congress and submitted to the United Nations to the Genocide Convention in 1951. There were some previous petitions that had been written by various organizations like the National Negro Congress and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, but they had submitted submitted their petitions to the Human Rights Council. This was to the Genocide Convention that had recently been ratified. So anyway, that's a little bit of rundown. And so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about how the tribunal drew upon or connected to that We Charge Genocide petition, especially these themes of like internationalism, because that permeates that petition as well. It was not only a critique of U.S. crimes against Blacks, right, but also that petition argued that the treatment of U.S. Blacks was being reproduced through the drive toward World War III and the dropping of bombs in Korea, the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan a few years earlier. So anyway, all of that to say, can you speak to how our current tribunal and that petition were speaking to each other?
Definitely. So I definitely feel like this tribunal took that same spirit, but tried to update it for 21st century conditions, right? So I feel like if you are alive and you have like a brain and eyes and ears in the United States right now, you see that over the past few years, there's been accusations of everybody committing genocide, everybody and their mama committing genocide, whether it's China, whether it's whoever. And so many people here in the United States take those claims coming out of the State Department and run with them with little to no investigation, right? But one of the things that's really interesting is that when you frame genocide in the terms of what happens to African people inside the United States, people start telling you about how you reach in, or it's not like, it's not all that. And so I think one of the things that was important with this tribunal was to constantly define for people what the definition of genocide is. I'm pretty sure that connected to the original tribunal that you just described, there was like a changing of the definition of what counts toward genocide. It has something to do with this idea of like in part or in full. And so that's one of the things that this tribunal really tried to demonstrate through the evidence that they presented, is that what we see happen to African people here in the United States doesn't look identical to what happened to Jewish people in Germany per se, because our genocide has been one that is long and slow. So it's more difficult to look at and point at and say, hey, look at this thing. But it was important to include First Nations people, important to include and I'll stop here. It was important to include First Nation people because there's no way to talk about genocide on this land that doesn't include what happens with settler colonialism, right? And then an important part that was brought out during the tribunal, why it was important to include people defined as brown, right, is because when you think about taking a petition to the UN that centers the claim of genocide, you don't also forget that many of those people here, even though many of them come by choice or come as migrants, come because of the stabilizing conditions that the United States creates in their own countries. So this was really sort of like taking that blueprint and that template and really adjusting it to the framing behind neo-colonization and the impacts of neoliberalism as well.
Let me just throw one quick thing in before we ask the next question. That point about folks being like, when it happens to Black and brown indigenous folks, oh, that's not, or especially specifically Black people, that it's not Black genocide. People. That's precisely what happened with Raphael Lemkin with the We Charge Genocide petition. So he's the person that sort of coined the term genocide and was instrumental in starting the Genocide Convention. When William Patterson and the CRC drafted the document, he was very much against it and was making these same types of arguments that what was happening to Black Americans was not genocide. And William Patterson was like, fuck that. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. Like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Like, when things happen to Black people, it all of a sudden the goalpost moves. So
yeah, no, right. And I even think the point you made, Salifu, about the kind of false notion of choice, when people make a choice to immigrate or to move place. I mean, we so often don't take into account the reasons why people are forced into those choices, right? They're forced into those choices because neocolonialism, or the remnants of, a former era of colonialism, have made it so that certain nation states are unstable, that civil wars are raging, that people are unable to take care of themselves, right? And even though we know that the conditions of life in the US don't necessarily amount to something better. There's a qualitative difference when you're moving away from, let's say, civil war on a daily basis, right? So I think it's important that you brought that up. So I'm also interested, and this is interesting because even over the course of this entire episode, we also spoke with Dr. Olivia Rutazibwa earlier about the kind of trifecta of ecocide, epistemicide, and thinking about how these make up what genocide is composed of, right? And so I'm interested to know a little bit more about, you told us about what the charges were, and so I'm interested to know what the outcomes were from the tribunal.
Definitely. All right, so like I said, over the course of 2 days, you had so many people come through and present so much evidence. And I can probably talk a little bit more about parts of that evidence that stood out to me later, but the outcome of the tribunal essentially came out on Monday afternoon. The 13 jurists came back to report that on all 5 charges that I listed earlier, the United States is guilty of all those charges. And I think that there is sometimes a immediate sort of knee-jerk reaction to be like, well, so like why does this matter, right? Like, and I have thoughts about why this whole thing is not just a symbolic action, why it is actually sort of like a real material maneuver toward, I think, the testing of a possible theory that could work for African people here in the United States. So hearing that verdict come back from the 13 jurists who actually came back and read it. All the videos are available online. I recommend people definitely go and check them out, because you hear all these people speak very passionately. Like, they don't come back and just be like guilty. They're like, nah, y'all motherfuckers did that shit. Like, y'all are doing that shit. And like, yeah. And so yeah, I'll stop there.
No, it's interesting because in Shoot This Shit, we also talked about this, but in Brazil, Bolsonaro was just found guilty of crimes against humanity, essentially for not taking the COVID-19 pandemic seriously. And he's been directly implicated in the deaths of over 600,000 Brazilians, right? And so there is something more than just a sort of symbolic nature when we say that these entities that continue to sort of benefit from our death are, even in a symbolic way, held accountable, right?
Right. And I think one of the biggest things that needs to be understood about the outcome, I think something that needs to, for a lot of people need to understand about the planning of this tribunal, is that this tribunal comes directly out of some inspiration from Brother Jalil Muntakim, a former Panther and a political prisoner who has been in prison for like 50 years before being released last year in 2020, who came back and hit the streets hard as fuck. And a year later was able to materialize this thing that he had been conceptualizing. Brother Jalil is also a member, well, I guess you could call it a member of the Republic of New Africa. He believes in New African independence, which is sort of this idea that African people in the United States are not Americans. There's no way to separate us from the fact that we are Africans. At no point in time do you just stop being an African. But one of the things that the Republic of New Africa notes through their analysis is that if the United States, if this government had ever intended to do right by African people, I don't think we would have to still be waiting around to see that happen. And so maybe we should test out a theory to see what we can create on our own. And a part of that also kind of goes back to the fact that we have a right to do so. Like, you can't just make us comply with the concept of we have to assimilate into capitalism and be a part of the imperialist project. If we choose not to want to participate in those things, we have a right to do that, right? And so a big part of this, I think, is being able to help us propagandize around that right, and being able to help us propagandize around our material condition. I feel like sometimes we get very swept up in, oh, it's just a little police brutality over there. Oh, that's just like a little dirty water in Flint. Oh, just like a bad maternal outcome here or there. All these things add up, and they constitute toward a larger thing, which is genocide. And I think we have a responsibility from the point of this tribunal moving forward to frame the analysis that we have around our conditions using that language. And I think that this tribunal was one, an example of what sort of like self-sufficient organizing can look like, and two, a really powerful organizing tool, because one of the outcomes of the tribunal is that Brother Jaleel, Brother Jihad, Pam Africa, who also asked that we call her by Queen Mother Warrior now, all these people who have fought and struggled so long for some semblance of dignity for African people in this country, plan to take this tribunal forward and make it into a people's assembly. So now what we're talking about is a project of organizing Black people across this country, city by city, state by state, block by block, into participation into assemblies that will develop the power to charge, indict in the future, enact consequences, whatever those consequences may look like. I can't speak to what they might look like. It could be a strike, it could be something more extreme, but the purpose is building power, because that's the thing that we lack here.
I just wanted to quickly throw out, when you're speaking about how Brother Jaleel Muttakim was in prison for 40 years, recently, just a couple of days ago, Brother Russell Maroon Schultz was granted a compassionate release and a medical transfer. But I just wanted to, when we think about genocide, right? The compassionate release came after, Russell Maroon Schultz was ill for a number of years and has I believe colorectal cancer, and is extremely sick. And it took all of that. It took 5 decades in prison and deteriorating health for the state to even have some sense of quote unquote compassion, right? And the first medical leave was denied. And so this is the nature of genocide, is that even the compassion comes after so much suffering. And that's the conditions of Blacks in the United States. We only get just the bare minimum after a profound and enduring sort of situation of suffering. So I just wanted to, and that's why this tribunal, I think, is so important, because it is laying this out, the conditions by which African people in this country live and suffer, and most of all, right, political prisoners. So,
right, what did Kwame Ture say? We're the only people that have to shed our blood to advance. It's true. I was just going to say one other thing that I wanted to really talk about was the feeling, like the vibe in the room while all of this is happening, as a young person who for the first time has had the opportunity to share space with people who I've read and studied, who have contributed to like my ideological development, to be able to sit like a chair away from Queen Mother Warrior, Pam Africa. All of these things kind of led to really intense feelings in the room for me. And the entire weekend was a very sort of like emotional and heavy thing for me, because what you see is our elders, like these are our elders being able for the first time in the instance of Brother Jaleel in decades to be able to complete the testing of theories that they've been developing and working towards for so long. And there's so much love between all of them in the room. Like they have this, y'all know elders be impatient. They have this thing where like, they can't even wait for you to finish introducing them before they come on stage. Like you get up to read Pam Africa in like bio introduction, and she gonna push you off the stage and be like, I got it, it's good, it's good. It's like hugs all around all weekend. They introducing themselves as, representatives of the People's Republic of Brooklyn. Like it's that feeling of like camaraderie and that idea that like we gonna win after all the shit that we know that they've been through was really crazy to watch and experience sort of firsthand. So I definitely left feeling very charged up.
Oh, thank you for that. You kind of already answered it, but I just want to ask more specifically. You already were talking about political prisoners, specifically Brother Jaleel. So what I think there's been obviously like CBS said with Maroon Schultz, and there's been more news here lately about political prisoners, but what role did they play in this tribunal and beyond just Brother Jaleel, but as well as everyone else, and not just role in putting it together, but just as a symbol and as an idea, what role do political prisoners play in understanding our struggle in relation to the tribunal?
Definitely. So I would say one thing is, so we was talking about how when you start talking about what's happened to Black people in this country as genocide, people start getting iffy and shifty about it. But when you have the proper analysis of our conditions, you understand it's nothing less than genocide. And so when we talk about like the consciousness raising, once you understand what's happening to us here is genocide, you start to move and act in different ways. And I think that we can point to most of the people who have become political prisoners throughout the decades as people who had a proper analysis of our conditions and were willing to move and act on genocide in real material ways. And that becomes a threat to the state. So you have to either eliminate them completely or you have to lock them behind bars where you can stop their activity, where you can stop that consciousness raising, where you can stop people from understanding that they exist under genocidal conditions. And so the role that political prisoners played at the not just in the development of the weekend, but even there during the weekend, it was like amazing. The first night was a culture night. The first people that some of the first people we heard from were Pete O'Neill and his wife Charlotte. His wife Charlotte is an amazing like musician and like spoken word performance artist, and we got a tribute from them on the first night. We heard from Seko Odenga, who was also there signing copies of Look for Me in the Whirlwind. We got testimony from Brother Jalil Muntakim, testimony from even younger people classified as younger political prisoners who talked about things like solitary confinement, who talked about the specific experiences that political prisoners have behind walls, behind jail, while they're in jail, right? Like not just the idea that you're, just like a quote unquote like regular prisoner, but you're somebody who's there because of the things that you believe in or because of the work that you tried to do. They talked about having their attempts at organizing behind bars stifled, torture, all these different, all these different things. But I think the number one thing that they were able to do all weekend that other people sort of who don't have their experiences weren't able to do was they were able to like incite the feeling. There's something different that happens when you hear it coming from somebody who's known it all along, who's tried to act on it, and like who's been prevented from acting on it. So it was very special to have them there.
There's just so much great information. I guess the last question is, given your analysis, given your political commitments, and your experience at the tribunal, what are some next steps? So that is to say, what can we do, those of us who are against genocide, who are dedicated to Black liberation and socialism? What are some next steps? What can we do to continue on not only this conversation, but to act on it, right? To act on not only charging the US government, but to also approach sort of like, how do we ameliorate the conditions caused by this genocide?
Yeah, so I want to shout you out because I came into this year charged up off the strength of an interview that you did. I can't even remember who it was, but it was like the end of last year or the beginning of this year where you was talking about how we have to get our international analysis up. And that was like a real sort of like firecracker on my ass to start to pay attention to these things a little bit more. I think the tribunal reinforces that we have to get our international analysis up. But I think in terms of tangible next steps, in the brief seconds that I got to dialogue with brother Jalil, he of course feels like everybody needs to read We Are Our Own Liberators. I agree. There's a chapter in that book called the Frohlenon Handbook, which is like a step-by-step guide for how to build revolutionary cadre across the country. And that is work and information that my organizations are engaging in as we try to reconfigure ourselves coming off the heel of this tribunal. Because a big part of what the tribunal is encouraging us to do is to think about taking our survival into our own hands. If we understand that these systems and structures aren't going to do it for us, then how do we start the process of building alternative structures, political structures, structures to feed ourselves, structures that will house people, structures that will provide medical care. All these things I think are the challenges that we are being tasked with as like a younger generation with the awareness of genocidal conditions is like we've thrown everything at the wall. We've done the Black president thing, we're doing the Black vice president thing, you know, we've done the voting thing, we've done the marching in suit thing. What comes next? Like, at what point in time do we take on the responsibility? And it's a heavy challenge. Like, it causes a lot of arguments. It's gonna cause a lot of disagreement. It's like not gonna be easy. It's gonna mean we're gonna have to give up a lot of shit. But I think that the propagandizing around the awareness of genocide is going to help us get to the next level for where we need to get. So I don't think we can afford another summer of outrage directed at a single issue thing. It can't be just police brutality anymore. We gotta put everything in, we gotta frame everything that happens moving forward in the context of genocide, and we gotta find a way to internationalize it. So we can't just keep talking about the problems that we experience here as like isolated things on two levels. Like I said, it isn't just a little dirty water here, a little flooding over there, some old people dying in a house over there. It's genocidal conditions. Let's frame it like that. Let's talk about it like that, because that awareness, I think, like Brother Jihad said, is going to prick our subconscious and get us to start moving like we understand the conditions that we exist in are not normal. They're not okay. They're genocidal conditions, and we have to save ourselves from them.
You can't make no fucking statues to critique of genocide, right? We don't need no more statues. You can't paint, they ain't gonna paint, no more genocide in yellow on the fucking sidewalk in DC, right? That you cannot co-opt a correct analysis in that way. So that's really, I think that's really on point. Where can people find you and contact you and commune with you on the internets?
I don't want nobody to find me, but y'all can go to hoodcommunist.org, and you can also go to LC Takes Action on Instagram and donate, because we got a lot of programs that we got to sustain and we need support.
Period. Thank you so much. This has been so informative. We can't wait to have you back to talk about even more happenings in them streets, especially to talk about your organizations and, everything that you're doing and programming. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. So for this segment of What We On, we wanted to think about how do we stay productive or not when we're traveling, or return to our writing or reading or research routines once we get back from travel. Because as you can see, we are no longer together. It is so sad. I am back in Chicago. Layla's back in Mississippi of Germany. And so we just, so basically I just wanted to sort of think about like, why is it, or how do we get back to work basically? So the first question is, oh, go ahead. Oh, wait. So,
well, it's just interesting because what came up when we were talking about what to talk about when we were on, we were actually reflecting on the fact that our vacation was a working vacation. And so even I think even that's interesting in this conversation, right? Like to think about what it means to take a break from something and to actually then get back into it, because we do actually need to think about why we continue to invest in these types of logics that say we need to be working all the time, and that we do need to engage in restorative practices, right? Which basically mean like we don't have to be working all the time, but then when we're not working, what does it mean to shift back into work mode?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because well, one thing, so I know that for me, it's very hard not to work. And it's not to say that I work all the time, because I don't. I'm actually kind of lazy, but I'm always very cognizant that I am not working. And so that's another aspect of being on vacation, is that it's genuinely not working and not even thinking about work and not having anxiety or guilt about the fact that you're not working. But also for me, I get that feeling like vacation just makes me feel like I'm going to be behind when I return, right? As opposed to it actually being, it is restorative and it's fun, but always in the back of your mind, there's like, oh shit, I got all this shit I need to do, on top of the fact that in vacation mode, we're still answering emails, doing presentations, reading over papers, doing interviews, whatever it is that we're doing. And so I know
But
for
you
me,
can't
I
fight that. Because you gotta fight. We can't be talking about we anti-capitalist, and then even in our sort of just daily lives, we can't remove ourselves from work. Like we, and I don't just mean you, I mean we, like we have to fight that. We have to be able to say that this shit ain't gonna be the end of the world. And sometimes that shit can sit on the shelf and I will see you when I get back. And I remember, this is just an anecdote. I remember when I was in high school and I think I had a test coming up or something. My mom was like, you're not gonna study, you're not gonna keep studying. It was like the night before. I was like, nope. Whatever I know right now is what I'm gonna know. And I ain't gonna know nothing else. And I'd rather get a good night's sleep than stay up studying. And I don't even, and I think that probably for me as a teenager at that time, that was, I don't know, maybe me being lazy or whatever, but I do think that that's a logic that we have to employ more often, that like, if people are not going to die because we don't do this work, like it can wait. Not to say we shouldn't do it, but it can wait. Like we do need to have moments and times where we're not thinking about certain things. And I think that that's another interesting thing about being academics, because sometimes I think people think because we have flexibility of time that we're not always working. And I think one of the things about work that is like work of the mind is that even though it might not be physically taxing on you all the time, it is just exactly what you described, is that even when you're trying to take a break, right? Even when you're eating dinner or when you go out on a date or when you do whatever, you're always thinking about what you could be doing, right? And so that is its own type of stress. I don't want to make a kind of comparison to physical labor or whatever, but it is its own type of stress when the type of work that you do is work that you can say to yourself, I could always be working, right? And that's something that I think we have to work to undo.
I don't know what that date thing is that you mentioned. I've never heard of the thing. However, I mean, I think that part for me, right? I think that what you're saying is absolutely right. It is adhered in capitalist logic. But I think for me also it's either a nostalgia or lamenting for a level of productivity that I had previously that I do not have in the panty. Okay. I have no struggle in me. I got no fight in me. I got no resilience. I fold like a lawn chair even at a whisper of adversity. Like I ain't got it. I ain't built for it anymore, which is so wild.
I reject that. I fully reject that. As your friend, as your colleague, as whatever, I reject that, because I also think like even that, right? Even just in the context of a pandemic, like shit is different. Like it's not the conditions of life are not the same. Like, I mean, I think about shit when I wrote my dissertation in 20 days, I wrote 100 and something pages. I do not have that right now. Like I don't have that at all. But I also don't necessarily know that that's something that I need to go back to, because I also remember when I was writing my dissertation, my hair was falling out. I was stressed out. I was crying all the time. You know what I mean? So like there are other things that are paired with those moments of productivity that maybe weren't necessarily healthy in and of themselves. And so I think that like that constant struggle, I mean, I do like if you all watched last season, you all know CBS is the queen of spreadsheets, and she had her days blocked out at 30 minutes, every 30 minutes of the day. And she was writing, you know, she had stuff in the pipeline. I've never had that level of productivity, but I've also just decided to accept myself.
Yeah, but to me, I mean, I think that I didn't have that stress associated with work because I had my days organized and you know, I didn't feel anxiety around work. I think that I did in a different way, but because I was so organized and because I was like, I'm a writer, so I write. This is what I do. And so I think it's that. And so I appreciate, you know, as my friend defended me, but it's true. I am not that. I don't have that level of productivity. I just don't. And I do want it tailored to where I'm at now, right?
Oh, but I didn't mean you don't have that level of productivity. I just meant I was rejecting the notion that you ain't got it in you and that you crumble. Like sometimes you have. I
do. It's true, but I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm saying it. That's just the reality of where I'm at currently, and it is a sort of, and that whole conversation is linked to the then stress of not working, because I don't have the same level of productivity to get back to. And so it does create a sort of, you know, a backlog real or imagined, because all of this, deadlines are relatively arbitrary. There's some things that are hard, but most things are just self-imposed. So, I think I wrote maybe one day.
She wrote,
and that was the day that you went. That was the day you went back to Germany.
I wasn't there to distract.
It's because you're adventurous. Like when we're together, we do stuff. I don't like anything. I don't do shit. When I travel, I do exactly what I would do at home elsewhere. And that would be right or watching that. I did binge You also, but the show You, not you, Layla. I wasn't stalking you. But so that was like the sort of one day I sat down for maybe 5 hours. I got a significant amount of work done. And I felt good about that. And then when I was on that long ass plane ride, I got some 8 hours. Oh my God. I got some work done. Right. But I mean, so I guess the moral of the story that we're saying is that we ain't got no silver bullet. We ain't even got no answers. It's just kind of like, it's something to think about. Is there a way in the panty or whatever to sort of set up and organize your time so that you can go on vacation and really be on vacation and not be worried about what there is to do when you get back. Or even if you don't, even if spreadsheets and organize your time is not your bag, how do you not have anxiety about work? And I think it's particular to academics, but I don't think it's exclusive to us. I'm sure that there are other professions and other industries where this is the same type of thing, whether it's constantly being on meetings, constantly being on the phone or whatever. And so I
also think it's relative. Because for me, after the stress of losing my mom, I had just decided that this job ain't gonna kill me. And so I was just like, you know what? Time is a colonial construct. I say it to myself all the time. Like honestly, and I don't even mean this as practice, but I cannot think of an incident where a paper was due, and in some instances, even job applications, where it was due on a specific date and there was some extenuating circumstance where I could reach out and couldn't ask for an extension. And because the thing is, when we say deadlines are self-imposed, obviously we set them because we want things to get done in a certain amount of time. And it's always a goal, but it's a goal, right? And the thing is, sometimes when you set a goal so that you do something towards it, not that you will always accomplish it. And I think that I have just tried to make peace with that. This conversation, I think, will be interesting between you and I once we both transition back to working full-time and trying to write. And when I say working full-time, I mean back into the classroom, back into department meetings and, students applying for all that kind of the other administrative stuff. Because right now, vis-a-vis other academics, we're in a very sort of luxurious position having a fellowship.
We're on sabbatical, period.
Yeah, essentially. But so it's interesting to think about it in all of those different contexts, right? On sabbatical, in regular work. And then for people who work, for me, which was the case before this job, I was working in a department where I was miserable with crazy ass motherfuckers who honestly on a daily, Sharice knows, on a daily basis, I'll be sitting there texting her in the midst of department meetings it's a good thing that I don't own weapons because I would hurt somebody.
And my response was, well, I do. So let me know if something needs to get done, let me know. I'm on the next flight. Yeah. So I think, go ahead.
No, that's what I mean. That's what I think about relativity. I think this is a time where I've been relatively less stressed in my life, and I'm just trying to hold on to that because I know it ain't gonna last forever.
It's true. Listen, all I wanted to do was make an appeal. Anybody that's in our LDI audience want to take me away from all of this? It's just let me just live a life of leisure and organizing and funding the revolution. Come on with it.
Well, okay, just read and write and work on nobody's timeline, which I think is actually ideal because so this is the other thing about the fellowship, right? Even though the fellowship is a luxury, one of the things that the academy, when it was set up for white men, recognized, and the same thing we know about the creative industries, is that in order to produce content, you need time. And you need time to think, you need time to absorb readings, life around you. And you can't produce in that industrial kind
rat
of
race.
Without having time to think, to sit back, to absorb, to process, to, resituate, reorganize your thoughts. And so that's also, a part of why I think I've kind of made peace with this kind of slower process, because I actually think that that's the way it's supposed to work. And this idea that you can like just boom, 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 knock things out. I don't know. I think it's counter humanity, right? Like it's just not really how we operate in a healthy way.
Well, I'm so glad you're at peace, because I am at war, like with myself. My brain is like, do this fucking work. And I'm like, I can't, I just, it's a penny. Like, I don't know what to do with myself. So, I mean, and I know that people who like work actual 9-to-5s who don't have this luxury are like, shut y'all goofy ass up.
Yeah,
and I get, it is goofy to a certain degree, but like you were saying, everything is relative. Like this is our life. And I think that we care about the work that we do. We love the work that we do. We feel like it's important. Beyond just the hoops we got to jump through to keep our jobs and stuff. And so I think that that's part of it as well, is sort of like the responsibility of it all, and feeling like you're not doing enough, or like, I'm not doing enough. I'm not, I'm already ensconced in the Ebony Tower, and now I have the nerve to not do my fucking work. Like, so it's all of that as well. So again, we ain't got no answers. We just what we are. This is what we thinking about constantly. And especially now that we gotta integrate back into life, so.
Yep.
All right, y'all. For my rant this week, I am going to drag Heathrow motherfucking airport. Let me tell you something, okay? I understand that Britain lost its empire, right? Lost its identity, but they ain't gonna find that shit in my luggage, in my carry-on little bottles, my little 100 mils. Like, what's going on? Two times I had a horrible experience at this airport, and they're so tedious. Like, if you have anything, any little random carry-on bottle of anything in your bag that you did not put in a little plastic bag, mind you, every single thing that you take on has to fit in this little plastic bag, and you have to be able to close it. And so there were toiletries getting thrown away, like left and right. The people were rude as fuck. Some man was like, well, we told you to put this shit in the basket. Like, if you don't do it, then you miss your flight. That's not on us. We're going to be fine. And so they were rude. Okay. They were inefficient. Hella people were missing their flights. And for what? Right? For what? I don't think that they stopped any plots. I don't think that they stopped any drug trafficking. It's just that fucking European tedium. And let me just tell you something else. Okay. I blame Brexit. I do. Because number one, there weren't enough people working. Number two, I feel like people mad, and so they're taking their rage out. The workers are taking their rage out on travelers. And three, it was horribly inefficient and so incredibly inconvenient. And so some people might say this is first world problems, fine, but it's really post-imperialism problems, or the loss of imperialism problems. And so I just hope, as the US reaches this imperial asymptote, that it doesn't fuck up our airports, because Heathrow is trash. Bottom 5. And that's my rant. All right, y'all, that is what we got for you today. But before we go, we have an announcement about next week's show.
So in episode 1, we mentioned that we wanted to institute a practice of having every third episode be a reading episode. And we've been talking about it, and one of the things that we hope we will be able to do with each reading episode is read a more contemporary text and be in conversation with the author of that text. And so for next week's show, we have decided that we will have Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni as our guest, and we will be reading his work, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization. It's a lengthy text, and we invite you all to engage the entire text, but for the purposes of the show, we will be focusing on the introduction, Chapter 6, Epistemic Legitimacy of Africa, and Chapter 9, Roads Must Fall. And so we will make the text available to you all via PDF. I think we're going to be able to share a Google link, a Google Drive link in the description of the show. And so please read, tune in, and be in conversation with us.
And even if you don't get a chance to read, it's not as if you'll be completely lost, but if you want to follow along, and even if you have questions, if you're reading and you have questions you want us to ask Sabelo, go ahead and submit those questions, and we look forward to engaging that reading with you
Where
all.
can they submit those questions?
You can submit those questions to thelastdopeintellectual@gmail.com. And y'all, that is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, so thank you for tuning in.
I'm Dr. Brown here with Dr. CBS, and thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. We're signing off. See you next time.